Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This is the first lecture of our series 1 lectures. The topic is object oriented programming. Today is the introduction and a quick comparison between the procedural and object oriented programming. Okay, this is a list of important topics which will be covered, and there may be few more as we go along to do the recording for the lectures for this series. First of all, we need to understand what is an independent procedure. On the left, a simple program is taken from the second lecture of the previous series. This program is simply taking input from the user through a GUI interface, the first name, and taking input from the user through a CLI interface, the last name, and then it creates a greeting message for the user on the CLI interface and then GUI interface. This is the very simple, trivial program, and the making of an independent procedure from this is also trivial, but the basic concept should be understandable. This is very simple. Here in this line and in this line, what we are doing a processing. In this processing, we are actually making a greeting message by putting the greeting message to the person with the first name and the last name. The same thing is happening here. The greeting message to the person with the first name and last name. So actually what we are doing here, we are making up a string to print on the CLI interface, and here we are making a string to print on a GUI interface, and the string we are making to print is actually with the greeting message. For example, as we practiced last time, Asim but. Asim is the first name, but is the last name, and then we give the greeting message, welcome, hello, Eid Mubarak to Asim but. So what we actually want here, we want to make an independent procedure. There are two tries here, but these are wrong tries. Let's explain one by one. We make a method, GMSG, greeting message method, which is going to return null, nothing, and it is going to accept 3 inputs, and it is going to display the greeting message to the person on a GUI interface. The problem with this method is, first of all, we need to understand why do we want to make an independent procedure. We want to make an independent procedure to reuse it within the same program or in many other programs we may develop in future. So we want to reuse. As we discuss in software engineering and software development, reuse is the key, is the prime focus concept. We do everything for the purpose of reusability. So we adopt many techniques, many methods, we make techniques, make methods to enhance the reusability. So the higher the reuse, the lower the cost and easier the maintenance. So reuse is the main thing. So we want to make a message, a method, procedure which accepts 3 inputs, and then this is going to display an output. The problem with this way of making a message procedure is, this is a dependent procedure. It is depending upon the print of a message on a GUI interface. Obviously, a user who wants to have a print on the CLI interface would never use this method, because this method becomes dependent on a GUI display. Similarly, in this message, we use CLI interface to print the message. The same reasoning applies here. This method is applicable. This method is useful by the developers who are actually developing to print on a CLI interface. This cannot be used on the GUI interface. This cannot be used for the CLI interface, and this cannot be used for the GUI interface. Doing this disturbs the independence of this procedure and reduces the reuse. What if we make a method independent of which interface it is going to be used to display at? The concept of making an independent procedure is like this. We must accept inputs like we are doing here, 3 inputs, and we must return a valid type. That could be user-defined type or primitive type. But we should not let the procedure do the other dependent system-related things, because that would make it dependent. We want to make it independent. The higher the procedure is independent, the higher the reuse of the procedure is. Now, here is a right example of doing it. We make a method which accepts 3 inputs and it returns a string type. So we accept 3 inputs, we concatenate the inputs to create a greeting message, and we return it as a string to the user. So once this is done, this is upon the user's requirement, that what the user wants. If he wants to, what the developer wants, if he wants to display on the CLI interface, he may use system.out.println or printf. If he wants to display on the GUI interface, he may use his GOption pane or any other method. So this is independent. This can be used by both the programmers, the programmer who intends to display on CLI and the programmer who intends to display on the GUI. The basic principle which is to be shown here on this little trivial example is we must make the program in this form, which accepts data types as inputs, primitive or user defined, and it should returns data type as output, primitive or user defined. Then this is up to the programmer how he would like to use it. I hope this is clear. With this little introduction of the independent procedure, let's take a look at procedure programming and then object-oriented programming. A procedure programming approach, a procedural approach or a program. I'm using Java as a mean to depict what a procedural program would look like. When you're given a problem statement, from the problem statement, the developer looks for the data to be used, meaningful data that can be used, primitive, smaller data, or non-primitive, bigger data structures, and then the procedure, the actions required to be performed on the data. So this is like processing. So the intention of the developer from the problem statement is to look for the data and the procedures. Now the data is becoming, as in the approach, in the design and development approach, the data becomes the global data, and all the procedures are procedures, functions. There are many names for this. For example, function, procedure, subprogram, subroutine, they all actually meaning the same thing. So the generic word would be subprogram. A main program is the main program, and all the others are subprograms. These are procedures. So actually, every program here has an access of the global data for read and write both purposes. Read, write both purposes. Read, write both purposes. So in this little program, this is the design of the procedure program, and this is the actually implementation of the procedure program in Java by using Java language. Java language is actually an object-oriented language, but we can use the this to make the procedure program. If we use Java as a procedure programming language, then we keep all the data here as a global data, and there could be many more data variables, primitive, non-primitive both, and then we may have a method, many methods, and then a main. Obviously, when we run the program starts execution from the main, and the main calls other methods. Other methods can call other methods, and they all have access to the global data. The issue with this is this global data is not the property, is not under the ownership of any of these procedures. So they all have the equal rights to access, to read, and to write back to the data. This is procedural programming languages. Now, the unit of program in a procedural programming language is a procedure, because procedure is the main meaningful processing of the data. So a unit of program in procedural programming language is a procedure. They all have access to the global data to read and to write from. Okay. So with this simple example, we can show that there's a main method and there are many other methods, and let's not discuss this because this is the need, because we're using Java language, and Java language, every program is a class. So we keep everything in a class. Let's move on to the next slide. An object-oriented program. Here is a diagram. From the previous diagram, the procedural programming language, the main calls functions. Functions may call each other. They all can access the global data, as you have seen on the previous slide. This diagram is taken from this source. This diagram is actually explaining that what is object-oriented programming. Actually, from the previous slide, the data is actually divided and given to the object. Data is divided and given to the object. Object-oriented approach. In an object-oriented approach, actually this slide, there are many things to be updated. What we can see here, these are the points from the previous slide, but we will discuss this in the light of object-oriented. And this program from the previous slide will also be discussed in the light of object-oriented. So the data, let's first discuss only this diagram here. This diagram. What do you see in this diagram? What I see, some labels, some text, or we can say we are looking at shapes on this diagram. Some of the shapes are text. They are written in simple text, keyboard text. Shape box, shape arrow, background color, box, two directional arrows, box, enclosed in an outer shape, few boxes and lines enclosed in an outer shape. So what we are actually doing, object-oriented approach is more natural than the procedural, in the context that when a user looked at a diagram, they see objects, they see things. For example, if you are given a diagram of a hill station area with some people and vehicles moving around, you can identify the hills, the cottages, people, cycles, cars, vehicles in that diagram, like we are identifying shapes in this diagram. So this is a natural way of identifying object. Obviously, when we identify an object, for example, in the hill station area example, if we identify a car object, so everybody knows what is the meaning of a car. Car is an object which has some behavior, which has some attributes, which has some data. For example, the car has a color, the car has a make, the car has a type, and the car runs. accelerates, deaccelerates. So these are the things coming into our mind from our general knowledge of that object. So looking and identifying objects is more natural. So identify a developer, in contrast to the procedural approach, in object oriented approach, a developer would identify the objects, and every object is a collection of data and procedures. So what actually is happening here, this part is being divided into many subparts, and these procedures are enclosed along with some part of the data into the outer shapes like here. So the whole procedural programming approach is going to be divided, some of the data, some of the procedures, into this one enclosing shape, referring to one object, similarly other object, and so on, many other objects. And objects are communicating between their procedure level. This is the concept of object-oriented programming. Then in object-oriented programming, rather than looking for data and procedure as a first step, we look for object as a first step. And then within the context of object, we look for its data required in the problem statement, and then its functions required in the problem statement. So the global data is actually broken down into multiple subparts of data distributed among the objects. Similarly, many of the methods, obviously there would be one main method. One main method can be placed into one object as well, which will be the actually main method with the main class, a class with the main method from where the execution would start. And then the methods and the objects will communicate by these arrow lines. So this is the concept. So this program here will be actually, this data will be cut down into many parts. These methods will be collected into many parts, and the respective data part and the methods set of sub methods part would be placed into another class. So there will be a class with the main method, there will be another class with some of the data and some of the methods. So this is the concept and the quick comparison between the procedural and object oriented programming. We stop the lecture here, and then in the next lecture we'll discuss the further details of the classes and object. In this lecture, the intention was to give you a quick comparison between the procedure and programming and the object oriented approaches and programming. Those who haven't subscribed should subscribe so that they can get the timely notification of the lectures and the activities happening on our channel. I would also like my viewers to become more active and participate by giving their feedback in the comments, asking their question in the comments for any improvements, the, the way we create the slides, the way I record, and the way I present. You can give me the feedback, and you can also write down the questions in the comments, which I will compile and then respond back to you. With this, we'll stop here. Until next time, take care.